And welcome to Tell Me Your Story, New Paradigms for a New World. We are giving you choices and knowledge of those choices to help make your dreams come true. We are here on Sundays at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., Monday mornings at 1 a.m., and Wednesdays at 9 a.m. for our special edition of Tell Me Your Story, where we stream live at those times at richarddugan.com. Our podcasts are on SoundCloud, iTunes, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, Spotify, many other locations across the internet, and we're also on YouTube. We hope you'll subscribe, at least click the notification, so when I post a new conversation, such as the one we were about to embark on, then you will be notified that, he's talking to somebody about something else. This should be interesting. And I guarantee you today will be interesting. We also, as I said before, remind you we are on YouTube as well. And we also ask that you spend some time going within, listening to that still small voice. Maybe we'll get into that today, maybe not, because our focus is going to be very, very, very fine-tuned, so to speak. And we also ask that if you can support us financially, we would greatly appreciate that. We have a PayPal account. It's there for your security as well as ours. With all that said, a returning guest to our program, continuing our conversation on his main theme about creating, if you will, a better human story. My guest is, of course, Andrew Schmookler. And Andrew, thank you so much for coming back again. And today we are going to stay focused on a subject that is part of your whole being, if you will, your whole the work that you are doing to try to, I want to say, educate as well as inspire people. So again, thank you for being with us.
Well, I am appreciative of the opportunity. Let me just say that it's not just creating a better human story. The work that I've done for the last half century has been trying to show that the truth about what's happened to our species is a better human story than the one we've been telling ourselves. That there's a way of understanding what happened that would be better for us, and it's more accurate as well.
Well, the title of today's program, folks, is How the Evolutionary Perspective gives us a better human story. Now, I realize that the evolutionary process, as it were, Andy, does take a look into the past, but also we're looking into the future. And this kind of ties into something I've said before in the program, and we're going to get into this aspect of our evolutionary perspective. I'm hoping this lays alongside what we're talking about, and that is the choices that we've made have put us where we are. Choices we're going to make will put us where we will be, but again, it's that third element that I always love to put in there, and that is our perspective, our view, our mindset as to what we think the future might be is going to determine our choices. Isn't that sort of part of this evolutionary perspective?
Well, the important thing is, do we understand the challenges that we faced? And I think we understand it poorly, in part because our view of the world is largely been formed by a civilization over a millennia, or whatever you want to say, in which people did not understand the situation they were in an evolutionary perspective. We have people who are trying to figure out what's going on here, who thought that the time began, a few thousand years ago, that didn't understand that the world that we in human civilization see around us emerged out of a 3.5 billion year process that created us. And then our species took a step unprecedented in the history of life, which is a step onto the path of civilization. And that created problems that we really should understand if we want to solve them. Because it's a toss-up right now. partly because we don't understand exactly what it is we're up against. I'd say it's a toss-up whether 200 years from now we will have gotten our act together so that humankind can sort of thrive on this planet, or whether we will have culminated the story of our species in some self-inflicted catastrophe. It's that you can see if you look at the rise of civilization in the context of the evolutionary perspective, something very different from what we customarily have seen. We talk about ourselves in terms like original sin and depravity of man. These are the product of people trying to understand a world that they took for granted it was like that. And if it was like that, we human beings must be as ugly as our history. You know, I think that I prove, using an evolutionary perspective, that the ugliness we see in human history is not human nature writ large. I think you can prove that, and that's one direction, and that's because the unprecedented step we took created an unprecedented situation, which generated a systemic force that has operated independently of human nature. I can prove that we are better creatures than we have thought ourselves to be. And I think that makes it a better human story, even if that were the only way.
Yeah. Well, you know, and just sort of a not so much a sidebar per se, but there are those who say that man, the human race, has basically failed 5 times. Every 250, I don't know what the exact number is, 26,000 years or something like that. Mankind, the human race, and again, I don't have all of the statistics, the numbers, the data per se, but they say we've gone around 5 times and we've destroyed ourselves. And that
I've been studying this stuff for 53 years. If I understand what you're saying, that's a crock. Sorry.
Okay. No, that's fine.
I used to like some of those books of history where we have aliens coming in, making rock patterns in Peru and stuff like that. You know, and Atlantis. You know, I enjoy those mythologies.
Yeah.
But having studied human evolution, of course, it's still unfolding in a lot of ways. And
True.
We understand how Homo sapiens is, one of, like 50,000 years ago, there were 3 hominin families, the Neanderthal, our kind, and the Denisovans. We didn't used to know that our family tree looked the way it does.
Yeah.
So things are changing, but the idea that civilization has emerged in the last 10 or 20, 12 or 1,000 years. It is a brand new history, chapter in the history of life, and it inevitably entailed certain problems that the evolutionary perspective makes it possible to see. Okay. I haven't gone into how.
Well, we will.
See it.
I guarantee you that we will.
And people can read my book, The Parable of the Tribes, out from the University of California Press, run a prize in the 1980s, and also I have briefer versions of it. But, I can lay it out. And as far as I can see, it completely holds water.
All right. Well, we're going to see what the container is that's holding that water as we continue with Andrew Schmookler. Again, our subject today on the program is how the evolutionary perspective gives us a better human story. The website, abetterhumanstory.org. That's abetterhumanstory.org. And we hope that you will stay with us as we continue on Tell Me Your Story. I'm Richard Dugan, your host, and Andrew Schmookler is our guest, and we're talking about how the evolutionary perspective gives us a better human story. And we've just begun to dive into this. And now, just to kind of answer these real briefly, just if you have the statistical information available off the top of your head, if not, that's all right. How long, as far as you know, according to records, has the human race existed on this planet? And then we're going to stay here with it. We're not going into aliens and all that stuff.
Well, let me answer it this way.
Okay.
Our ancestors go back a billion years.
Okay.
They don't look like us, you know.
Sure.
They don't look like us until you get, let's say we parted from the chimpanzees something like 7 million years ago. But they were our ancestors too at that point. But if you ask, when do the archaeologists say Homo sapiens?
Mm-hmm.
This is Homo sapiens. It's not a precursor of Homo sapiens. It's not Neanderthal. The answer is, at the moment, and this number has not stayed stationary in the years I've been looking at it. 300,000 years. They found something like in Morocco, Spain area, the very northwest tip of Africa. And now they're finding that in recent weeks, there are new things about how we're the product of a variety of different groups that were migrating around Africa for some time and interbreeding. So they're distinguishing, various things that flowed in. But anyway, the answer is, we've got ancestors that were mammals when the dinosaurs went extinct.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't start any place. I mean, it goes all the way back to one-celled creatures.
Right.
We have ancestors, but if you talk about when do we become primates, when do we become some branch of Homo,
mm-hmm.
When do we become Homo sapiens?
Mm-hmm.
That's 300,000 years.
Okay, so we'll kind of start there, and I would venture that that even back then there was a strong tribal context to the civilizations that existed.
These are not civilizations, and
societies, communities.
Here's the point I want to make about up until 10 or 12,000 years ago.
Okay.
They're hunting-gathering bands.
Okay.
There's a certain amount of variety, but here's the crucial point. They were already, even though they were already cultural, like they had languages, they had tools, a variety of ways, and they had domesticated fire. They were already doing something kind of special, but in a basic way, the lives they were leading were still continuous with our primate past. Chimpanzees, gorillas, they our closest ancestors, they move around the world as hunter-gatherers or gatherers or whatever. Our ancestors were primates who traveled around in bands, and in fundamental ways, it stayed the same until they started rearranging the ecosystem and stopped being hunters and gathered those animals into pens. That's a new step. Nobody had ever done anything quite like that. And stopped being gatherers, or gradually changing from gathering plants to domesticating them, creating gardens, and eventually leading to agriculture. This is a new thing. This is not continuous. And the result of those changes is, though the hunting-gathering bands were, in terms of size and structure and ways of living off of nature, mm-hmm. were essentially still primate bands. Here we've got a new kind of a life form. We've got the creature itself inventing a new way of living, which makes possible different sizes, different structures, all kinds of things. It's a breakout from what had gone on before for millions of years. Mm-hmm. And so I define civilization this way. It's those societies created by a creature that has extricated itself from the niche in which it evolved biologically. And the evolutionary perspective, it comes in here because the essential thing about the idea of a niche in which you have evolved biologically is that evolution, which is continually choosing what can survive over what cannot, it is continually working to create order. There's incredible order even at the level of the cell. There's an incredible order at the level of the whole planetary biosphere. Mm-hmm. And in between, there are incredible orders in each individual creature, in each ecosystem, etc. That's what it does. So when you have a primate band, the whole system is dynamic. It's not station. It's not, there's climate changes that happen and all kinds of things change, but overall, what's being created is something which is part of an order in which things have been shaped so that the interactions among the parts are harmonious with the needs of life to survive into the future. Okay. So I have a little thing I use to sort of characterize the order that the evolutionary perspective reveals, and that is the lion and the zebra and the grass work together to create a perpetual motion machine, even as they devour each other. So here comes a creature that is not evil, doesn't have to be evil. It doesn't have to be evil to unleash evil, is sort of the point.
Yeah.
It takes the step that it takes that's unprecedented, because unprecedented that there's a creature that has that kind of creative intelligence. I mean, the chimpanzees can dip a stick into a termite, they got tools a little bit. Sure. But we went so far beyond that it's really becomes a very different thing. And with our unprecedented creative intelligence allowed us to invent a new way of life so that we get to solve problems in ways that were not selected for by natural selection, but that we're inventing. And that is, it's the wonderful thing about our species. We're so creative. No wonder they say we are created in God's image, the creator. I mean, that's what we are. We're the species that's a creator. But it turns out that it's a dangerous thing because we have left the order that the evolutionary perspective shows us is key to understanding life.
I think that the example
and that means, and if when we leave that order, we go into a disorder, and that's the next chapter of this.
Okay, well, we'll go into that disorder in just a moment. But what you said earlier about the order using the lion, the zebra, and the grass makes perfect sense to me. As far as that, as you refer to it, as a perpetual motion machine, so to speak. It makes
all we need is the continuing input of energy from the sun.
Yeah.
And for not to have a huge asteroid hit us. Otherwise, life knows how to take care of perpetuating itself.
Well, and again, hope doesn't do us much good. I hope that doesn't happen, but you know what? You can have all the hope you want. If there's one heading this way, I don't care how much hope you have. Unless you're Elon Musk or some of these other billionaires who have a rocket that they can jump on to get off the planet. It's a done deal.
Fortunately, the creative species, Homo sapiens, has enough knowledge about the possibilities that some people have thought creatively about, okay, well, what if there is another one of those dinosaur killing sized asteroids heading our way? What can we do about it? And people are studying that question. Yeah. And there was a recent experiment where they used an impact on an asteroid and measured how much they were able to affect the flight path of it. So we're working on that aspect of how can our human civilization survive. But we need to do a better job of dealing with the destructive forces operating in civilization.
Right.
That are creating climate change and that might lead us into a nuclear holocaust. Those are the dangers that concern me.
Yeah. And they concern me as well, because I don't want to have to stop doing these programs and educating and enlightening people. I don't know the kind of equipment they use on the other side. So let's do everything we can. And I'm going to ask you this in regards to what you just said, in regards to these various. And I'm going to put the label on that. Okay. I'm actually a firm believer in whatever is happening. It just is. It is the way that it is. There's no judgment. It's neither good nor bad. It's just the way that it is. In other words, asteroids and meteors flying through the universe is just what they are. Supernovas exploding. It's just what they are. Cells in the human.
There isn't a moral dimension to the question.
Exactly. That's what I'm getting to.
But there is a moral dimension to the question of whether human civilization will get it together enough so that we won't have things like a a human monster like Vladimir Putin in charge of a massive nuclear arsenal. I mean, that's no way to run a railroad.
No, it's not.
We haven't solved that problem.
Well, I'm going to dive into another subject here in just a moment, but I remind you, listeners, you're listening to Andrew Schmookler and a betterhumanstory.org is the website, and this is Tell Me Your Story. I'm Richard Dugan, your host, and Andrew Schmookler is my returning guest. I love having you on the program because of these conversations. This one is very focused in this respect, and I want to go to the point you made just before I gave all that information there, and that is a person like a Putin, and we've had hundreds, if not thousands of them through human history. So the question that I want to pose to you before we get into more of this thing, I want to go to the half glass full kind of deal and also the other things. What are your thoughts? And this might be a little more esoteric, and certainly if this is off the beaten path, please then just ignore it and we'll move on. There are those who believe, and it is a belief, and this is one of the other things that I'm beginning to understand more and more these days, especially with some of the interviews I've been doing, that everything is just a belief. We really don't know. There's no hard fact.
Let's get to the belief.
Okay. Let's get to the belief. But the belief that there are positive and negative energies or influences, and that the more people who are focused on chaos and catastrophe and that negative aspect, like what you see in the news, on the news media, right? In the news media, actually you draw to you those kinds of energies and chaos. All right. And so forth. And I could give examples. I won't go there because I think you know what I'm talking about. And so if the planet is putting off this negative energy, it's going to draw to it. It's kind of like the law of attraction.
What do you mean by the
pull
planet?
to it meteors and asteroids, and we could have these kinds of calamities. Is that anything along? Does that even play a role in any way, shape, or form in what we're talking about?
Let's make a distinction here.
Okay,
I mean, it's important to talk about good and evil.
Okay.
Which is another dimension of my thought that I wasn't planning to get into, but
well, we can touch up on it and we'll move on.
They're really connected.
Okay.
But the issue of good and evil, let's not talk about asteroids or anything like that. There's a dichotomy that needs to be made in the evolutionary perspective between the realm of life and the realm of not life.
Okay.
As far as I can tell, at least, the realm of not life, the issue of good versus evil doesn't arise. It's just things happen. But when you get into the human world in particular, I mean, the reason why Genesis has human beings, the ones that eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. See, what happened is that we unleashed a force when we stepped into civilization that I spend a lot of time in the last 20 years showing meets this definition: a coherent force that consistently makes the human world worse, or consistently spreads a pattern of brokenness is another way I like to put it. And that requires talking about what do I mean by brokenness. But that got unleashed by that dynamic that I was alluding to before, that when you step into when you step out of the natural order, you step into a disorder, and out of that disorder there emerges a coherent force that consistently makes the human world worse. And that is my definition of evil, because if you study how it operates in the realm of cause and effect, you can see that this thing emerges.
Yeah.
That it is coherent, that it does work consistently to spread, to make things worse. It spreads a pattern of brokenness in shape-shifting ways. And one of the ways it manifests itself is bringing people like Vladimir Putin into power, and bringing people like Donald Trump in the United States into power. You can see that coherence in the fact that white racism, for example, and a certain kind of hysterical paranoia that's been in American politics for generations, and the greed of a corporate system epitomized by the Koch brothers, and the hypocritical Christianity epitomized by Jerry Falwell Jr. down in my congressional district at Liberty University. I mean, you can just see all these things forming a coherent force, and all of what they do in the world seems to make it worse. So you get to see that there is a spiritual, in a sense, dimension to what's happening in the human world, and those positive and negative energies that, as I understood what you were saying, that there is a sense, yes, there is a sense in which there are these coherent forces that I think is what you're calling the positive and negative energies. There are life-serving forces. There are life-serving forces. I think that human nature is better than we think it is. I said that before. I mean, if you went around the world and you asked people, what kind of world would you like to live in? One at peace or one at war? One where justice thrives, or one afflicted by massive injustices? One where there's love that rules, or one that's hate? I think the overwhelming majority of people would say the positive one in all of those. I mean, there are some people who might, if they're being honest, I mean, we see some of these people create conflict. I mean, it is a person like Putin that creates the first major war in Europe since 1945. It is a person like Trump that turns our politics into the most toxic, such that, whereas I was talking about the dangers of civil war a good long time ago, it has become a regular topic of conversation, that we are so divided, making the world more broken at every turn, making sure that instead of cooperation for the greater good, which is what positive energies do, we have we have people at each other's throat in the kind of conflict that's embodied at this moment by a Republican Party in the House that is saying, holding a gun to the nation's head and saying, meet our demands or we'll blow the country's head off.
I find it interesting too, because of everything you've just said, especially using the reference points that you've used. And again, I'm not going there. I'm just making an observation that the group, the individuals in particular, but also the groups they represent, that accuse the other side of, for example, censorship and all of these different kinds of things, are more guilty of it on one hand. And I'm not casting aspersions, don't get me wrong, but I'm just making a point, because you've got somebody like DeSantis in Florida who has banned the word gay. If you say gay, which is a violation of the First Amendment, then you could get fined or jailed. And he's eliminating books from the libraries. Some of the libraries in schools are empty.
And punishing a corporation for expressing its disagreement with a matter of,
it's like, wait a minute. You're accusing the other side of all of the things you're doing. And it's just weird. It's just weird.
Well, it manifests brokenness in several different ways.
Exactly.
I mean, I'm continually puzzled by, I mean, the hypocrisy that you've described. I mean, the hypocrisy, you can show it with respect to the debt ceiling, you can show it with respect to impeachment, you can show it, everything's a witch hunt, but the accusation that you stole an election when it is patently obvious, it is the same guy who's trying to steal. That hypocrisy, you kind of wonder, do they actually believe what they're saying? In which case, there's a kind of brokenness, which you can see in human history.
Exactly.
That people believe that they're representing, say, the will of Christ, while they massacre people on the way to do the Crusades.
Exactly.
They really do believe that they are on the side of God when they do the opposite of what they say they believe in. Or is it a matter of deception?
Exactly. I want to talk about human nature, and we're going to do that as we continue with Andrew Schmookler. A betterhumanstory.org is the website, and I'm going to have you run down in just a moment a couple of the important books. You mentioned one already, which I want people to get a hold of because I think they're fascinating, and what you have to offer is that. And we ask you to stay with us here on Tell Me Your Story. I'm Richard Dugan, your host. We're here with Andrew Schmookler, and we're talking about this whole aspect of human nature in that respect, but also how the evolutionary perspective gives us a better human story. And you pose one question in particular that I find fascinating, and of course you've touched upon it in most every program we've dealt with that we've had you on with. And that I'm going to just ask it pointedly because it seems to me extremely important for people to do this self-evaluation as a human being. Who are we, human beings by nature? What is our true human nature if it's not a genuine evil, destructive kind of thing in what we're talking about?
So one of the things I say that I prove, which is connected with that, the ugliness is not human nature, is that any creature on any planet that takes the step out of the niche in which it evolved biologically onto the path of civilization will inevitably plunge itself into a social evolutionary process as destructive and ugly as the one that we can see in human history. So when you look around the world or you look back through history and you see, geez, what a lot of monstrosity there is there. What a lot of ugliness, what a lot of tyranny and enslavement and lust for power we see. That we should not see it as reflecting who we are, because any creature would have, and I say, I don't know if there are other civilizations, but we know that there are billions of planets just in the Milky Way, and there are billions of galaxies. So I'm imagining there are a bunch of places where somebody has evolved and gotten to the point of having the smarts to do like what we did, to extricate themselves from the niche, from the biological order, and then they will plunge themselves into a place where the interactions of these new life forms that are invented are not regulated in any way. They're not regulated by the biological order because they left the natural order. That's the point. That's the definition. And it's not regulated by any human order because it's inevitably going to emerge in a very fragmented way. It's not like there's going to be anybody's power to come together and agree, let's abide by these rules. There will be no rules. There will be anarchy. There will be nothing to stop those with a desire to take more than they are entitled to from trying to do it. You can't do that in the rest of the natural world for the most part. They are confined to the limits that are constraining them out of biological evolution so that they would fit into this perpetual motion machine. But we're not. Once we step onto that path, those orders have gone away, and the lack of order inevitably means anarchy. It's a particular new kind of order. The philosopher of anarchy is the Englishman Thomas Hobbes of the 17th century, and he describes it accurately as inevitably leading to a war of all against all. And my parable of the tribes is a way of showing it. It's inevitable that these civilized societies living within reach of each other, eventually there will be a war of all against all. And what that means is that only those cultural options that are consistent with meeting the requirements of a world in which there's a war of all against all will survive. The other ones, if you can't survive that war of all against all, you're out of there. It's like an NCAA tournament with certain criteria for who gets to go to the next round. And the criteria are, can you prevail in a war of all against all? That's a selective process. It's parallel to biological evolution, but it's very different because it's taking place not in an order, but in a disorder of anarchy. And we can see what emerges in anarchy twice in my lifetime, once in Lebanon in the late 70s, early 80s, and once in Somalia in the early 90s. There was anarchy. The governing structure of those societies broke down completely. And within a fairly short period of time, you see what emerges to govern, to rule, to dominate. And I refer to the spirit of the gangster. I mean, we call them warlords usually in that context. But we can see the same thing was happening from the beginnings of civilization. It took a while to take off, but basically the war of all against all inevitably means that the spirit of the gangster will have a disproportionate say in how the system evolves. And it's not to say that the spirit of the gangster is what has the determining influence. It's the nature of the system that has a determining interest. The nature of the system is anarchic. The anarchic system inevitably creates a selection for the ways of power. Only they get to survive, and all the other cultural options get swept away. And so that's why any creature on any planet is going to have this selection for the ways of power. And you'll end up with a disproportionate number of people like Putin and Hitler and Ivan the Terrible and all the emperors of the empires of the early civilizations, in the pharaohs and the kings of Persia and the kings of China and the Aztec regimes here and the Incas. These are the things which emerge, and they are ugly because the selective process said that prevailing in a war of all against all favors ugly things.
You know, there's one phrase that I have uttered on this program a number of times that I hope it codifies what you're talking about in terms of order, in terms of that example you gave earlier about the lion, the zebra, and the grass, that when, and the disconnect, if you will. And that phrase is this, that nature, as we call it, is our greatest teacher. And I have to tell you that I firmly believe that. And that's the reason why we have gotten away from that. We have not listened to or watched. And I don't know about you. They're in, is it Virginia or West Virginia?
I'm in Virginia. West Virginia is just over that mountain over
there. Over that one right over there. Okay. But I live up on a mountain above Santa Barbara where we have...
Lucky you.
Yeah. Well, we have I don't know if you call it a flock, a herd, what have you. It's not that many, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 deer, a female who gives birth every so often to a few fawns or doe or whatever they are. We have occasionally who's creeping through the property where we live, maybe a bobcat or a mountain lion. We've had bears up on the property, which I have seen face to face. We used to have a whole flock of turkeys, wild turkeys. Oh, it was wonderful.
Do you drink that stuff?
I'm sorry?
I say, do you drink that
stuff? No, unfortunately, no, I do not. But the thing is what I have noticed is that as I am working, for example, right now, this particular season, we are in the process of making our properties across Santa Barbara and the county in California fire safe, because obviously things are drying out. They're supposedly supposed to get more rain, but that aside. And as I'm outside and whether I'm whacking weeds or I'm cutting up a dead tree that's fallen to make for firewood for the following season, or whatever it is that I'm doing, feeding the chickens, we have chickens as well. There is a sense of calm, a sense of peace that comes over me most times I say. And that's why I constantly, and I think about this, and I want to ask you about this. Have there not been, and again, if I'm using the wrong word, please correct me. Have there not been civilizations in this country, if not around the world, who were in order? They did listen to nature, and they did follow nature's leading when it came to their sustainability where they lived.
Well, the answer is that, since we became civilized, well, even before we became civilized, the Paleolithic hunters, well, it's uncertain whether they led to the extinction of, certain animals, but humans were already getting to be a little bit dangerous before we were civilized, but just a little bit.
Okay.
But once we became civilized, so my response to you is, I look out here on the forest that I live on. I came out here to live here because I want my spirit nourished by the natural order. But we're also in a very mixed relationship with nature, inevitably, because we're not of the natural order in the same way that our ancestors 20,000 years ago were.
Yeah.
And so when you talk about, for example, the way that you folks up there in the mountains above Santa Barbara need to transform your landscape in ways that will protect you from fire danger. We're talking about climate change here.
Sure.
So we're talking about the ways in which you and I and all of us are part of a civilization whose relationship to nature has been disruptive in a great many ways.
Oh, yes.
I was thinking today about writing a piece that starts with all the invasive species that I go around, trying to get rid of, from an invasive wisteria and garlic mustard and autumn olive. I'm continually waging war against the invasives, but the ultimate invasive species are people like you and me.
Yeah, you're right.
And so, if we want to live in harmony with nature, we need, when we decide, well, should I indulge myself by driving to such and such for such and such purposes? Because I'm contributing to the destruction of an order of the Earth's climate system with potentially catastrophic results. So how much am I supposed to entitle myself? We have to not only appreciate nature, but because we've become more powerful than we were really entitled to be in terms of maintaining order, at least so far, for 10 or 12,000 years, our effect on the health of the biosphere has been negative. But it's acceleratingly negative now. It's not just a matter of spreading the Sahara or denuding the great oak forests that the Romans turned into their navy. This is disrupting the fundamental climate system on which we depend for our food, in which the international order depends for any kind of stability, or so we don't have tens of millions of people migrating across borders, creating chaos and maybe war. We've got a job to do to harmonize our planet, our civilization, with the needs of the natural order. And we're not going to be able, as far as, when I first got this vision back in 1970, I had this sort of yearning that we might return to a harmony with nature that was just purely natural. Could we become a civilization of hunter-gathering bands? Well, the planet would probably support maybe, I don't know, 10 million or 12 million people. Who's going to decide which of the then 5 or 6 billion people, gets to survive? Anyway, I realize we can't go back. It was a nice dream, because I had a religious feeling, in a sense, about harmony. But the nature of our challenge is, the evolutionary perspective shows that the things that life created, the balances, lion, zebra, grass kinds of things, that made it possible to get a perpetual motion machine, that's what we've got to make artificially now out of our civilization. We need to make a civilization that is viable for the long haul.
Yeah.
And that's going to be a huge challenge. But the depressing things about it is the limited extent that we even conceptualize. We got to do that.
Yeah.
Human civilization is not going to continue on this planet indefinitely if we don't do that.
Yeah. It's interesting too, with some of the stories that I have heard, in particular surrounding the what seems to be becoming a rather controversial subject, AI, or artificial intelligence. And I'm sitting here thinking, you know what? I don't care about artificial intelligence, because that isn't where we need to have our minds and hearts. What you're talking about has nothing to do with technology. It has to do with what's going on inside of us, that we need to, I don't want to say necessarily change, but needs to shift. It needs to shift. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Well, I say that when we departed from the natural order, we plunged into a process that we've never controlled.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, we've had some say in how things go, and people do, but we're acting in a situation we didn't choose. It has ramifications. So we put your challenge to me again, so I can get that handle again.
Basically, it has to do with the fact that, as it's phrased on this program by some of my guests and myself, and let me back that up. Let me quote Einstein. I think it was Einstein who said this, you cannot solve a problem, or I like the word challenge, deal with a challenge with the same consciousness that created it. And that's where, for example, our government is right now. As an example, they're still using the same consciousness that created the government. They're not willing to, and I'm going to use your word in here, they aren't willing to evolve to any next level in terms of considering new and different ideas, i.e., maybe using nature as an example, in order to help us to move forward.
Well, the world, if you buy what I say I proved, I won't claim to have proved it here, but I do prove it. But if you believe me that I can prove that a coherent force that consistently makes the human world worse, and that moves through the human world in shape-shifting ways over time, then you can say that there is brokenness in the human world at all kinds of levels, from the international system to our consciousness and points in between. So, as for Einstein, one of the things that needs to change is our consciousness. And what I'm trying to do here, when I say I've got this better human story, is I believe that if we understand the human story better, we will do better in addressing our challenges. It will, in other words, buying what I've been building as a coherent way of seeing the human situation means having a different consciousness. Mm-hmm. It means seeing things differently. Mm-hmm. And so that is indeed an important thing to do. But it is only part of a multidimensional part of addressing the inadequacies and brokenness of the structures in the human world, including our political system, but also including our corporate system. For example, I've done some writing called "Who Will Kill for Money?" Mm-hmm. And the answer is every industry that has faced that choice about whether to kill and enrich themselves further, or to act like they put the lives of other people ahead of their profits, has chosen to kill. Mm-hmm. And I know a lot about this, actually. I have a friend who's made a living for almost half a century testifying against the asbestos industry. And we know about the tobacco industry. I mean, there's that movie with what's his name, Russell Crowe, The Insider. We know that they were willing to kill to keep their profits going. And now we got the fossil fuel industry with the most with a whole greater order of magnitude. So is that a matter of human nature? No, I think you can show that there are dynamics at work in our economic system that create industries that will make decisions to kill for money if that's the choice they face. I asked my friend who's done all this testifying about asbestos, can you give me a single example of an industry that when it found out that what they were doing was killing people, chose to help save lives rather than boost their own profits? Mm-hmm. I think he would know if the answer was yes, and he said the answer is no.
Yeah.
So there is a dynamic that needs to be corrected that operates in it's not necessarily human ugliness. Mm-hmm. There is a dynamic. You can see how corporations and industries evolve based on the reward structure and the survival structure, mm-hmm. operating in an unregulated market economy. I'm not against the market, but you gotta recognize its tendencies and its blind spots and correct for them. Making a whole civilization is a multidimensional task, but it's the only job we got, because the fossil fuel industry shows that if you don't address that, you can put the survival of your civilization at risk.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there are even groups who are, as you described, not just corporations, but even groups. And again, not wanting to be political by any means, but to show an example. You have a group in this country that just received from our Supreme Court a great lift. Now, I was a member of an employee at a Christian radio station back in the 80s, about 8 years after Roe v. Wade was passed. And of course, that's been overturned. So you have this group of people in this country that believe that they're pro-lifers. They believe, that, whatever they believe in terms of the infant, that we need to make sure that those babies are born.
And whatever they believe in relation to women, too.
Right. And then there's the paradox part of this, that they have no compunction to incarcerate people and then put them to death. Now, you're either pro-life from birth until a person's natural death, or you're not.
They're also for capital punishment. So
that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. Capital punishment
has got to do with their fallback position would be we're for innocent life.
Yeah,
to protect innocent.
Exactly.
Life.
But my point being, it's out of order. It's out of order. And then of course, my limited understanding of our prison systems, of our what's the word I want here that describes the whole industry in terms of incarcerating people.
Correction?
Correct. Thank you. The corrections industry, the corrections institution is supposed to be there, not only for people to pay their debt to society, but there was supposed to be a rehabilitation component. And
may I break in?
Yes, you may. Yeah, absolutely.
Because I don't want to lose touch with something you said.
Okay.
I'm sorry to cut you off with your.
Absolutely, no problem. Go ahead.
I know that impulse to write a little op-ed, and but it's a worthy subject. So
yes,
but I want to address what you said. You don't want to be political by any means. Is what I wrote down. You said.
Yes.
Let me say, I think I understand where you're coming from when you want to disavow that you're trying to be political. But let me tell you why I think you should feel good about being political.
Okay.
Let me define political as politics is the place where a society makes collective decisions about who's going to wield power. In some societies, it leads to something like Adolf Hitler emerging out of the politics of the Weimar Republic by the means of his quest for power. And by those politics, he became der Führer and changed human history. In the United States, we had founders that tried to make political to operate in such a way that the will of the people would ultimately choose the course of the nation. And there are all these things in between there too. So the question of who wields power at a time like ours right now in America is essentially the central challenge that we face in our times as Americans, because the choice has boiled down to not like when I was growing up, Eisenhower versus Stevenson, or even Reagan versus Carter, or Bush versus Dukakis.
Mm-hmm.
That was politics in a normal American way. But when one political party gets somehow hijacked by something that looks like a coherent force that consistently spreads a pattern of brokenness, or a consistent force that consistently makes the human world worse. And you are starting to give a compendium of ways, the list of ways that we could describe how this once respectable party is now making the human world worse.
Mm-hmm.
We've gone from disagreeing about policy. Like my father was an economist, so I was brought up to understand Keynesian economics, and there were conflicts between economists like him and some more conservative economists that didn't buy Keynes's idea about the role of government in managing the business cycle by spending when the economy is overheating. Taxing when the economy is overheating, and spending when the economy has an insufficiency of demand. Paul Krugman is a Keynesian economist. He's brilliant. It's great. Keynesian economics is basically good. And there were disagreements with a lot of Republican-leaning economists.
Mm-hmm.
That was regular American politics. Reasonable people can disagree about difficult things to judge. That's not the nature of American politics in our times.
No.
And so we have, basically we're dealing with and on my website, I have a piece called The Battle Between Democracy and Fascism, which I deal with both as something which is characterizing our times globally and the American political system. And that democracy versus fascism battle maps rather well onto those two coherent forces, one of which makes things better and one of which makes things worse. Something that is reasonable to call the battle between good and evil, because they act that way. So I think our responsibility right now, when the survival of American democracy is in jeopardy in a way I never would have imagined it ever would be, but it is. And if America becomes a fascist nation in, say, a decade from now, the prospects for humankind's survival and for decency and humanity to thrive on this planet in the meanwhile takes a big hit.
Yeah.
So please be political.
Okay.
To everybody. Please be political.
Keep that definition in mind.
We can't afford to lose our democracy. We cannot afford to blow up this planet.
Yeah. And of course, when I use that term, I don't want to be political. It's more in terms of saying, look, these are just my observations. Okay. I'm not going to label it as one thing or another. I'm just saying, this is what I'm seeing out there. I'm seeing the paradox. I'm seeing the dichotomy. I'm seeing the contradiction, or to quote you, Andrew, I see the disorder. I see the disorder. And I often talk about.
So what's the nature of your humility there? Because I don't share that myself. Are you saying this is what you see, but you're not sure you're right?
No. It's what I see, period. It's my observations of what I see and saying, look, people, open your eyes to what's happening. Do not take sides. don't take sides. Do something. Yes, I agree with you. Do something. I mean,
I say take sides.
Okay.
I say take sides. I mean, we have a clear-cut battle like we didn't used to have. I mean, the Republican Party was a normal, decent American party when I, until I was, well into my 40s anyway. So, but that's not what we're dealing with now. I don't know, as a student of history, I don't know a single major advanced democratic society that has generated a political party like this one. This is extraordinary. I mean, if you went back to, say, when Reagan was president, which is 1981, 1989, and you asked a group of people, Americans generally, or Reagan supporters or whatever, what would you think would happen if the presidential candidate of one of our two major parties, without naming parties, tried to pull a coup d'etat right in front of our eyes, that wielded a big lie to try to overturn an election, to seize power that the constitutional process had determined that the will of the American people, as rendered through the constitutional process, it said they wanted to take it away from him. What would you think the chances would be that 2.5 years later, that president who tried to seize power in a coup d'etat right in front of our eyes would be the overwhelming favorite to be once again the nominee of that party? So here we are back in 1980s, and we ask a group of Republicans, decent Republicans with conservative values, the kind of people I talked with in the 90s here in the Shenandoah Valley when I had my own radio show, loved their they would have said that could never happen. Conservatives would never, ever go there. We revere the Constitution. We would never go for a guy who is willing to do that to the country in order to hold on to power for himself, because we believe in good character. We would never believe that he would be so selfish that he would be just the opposite of love thy neighbor as thyself, giving no weight to the values he was trampling on, because that's contrary to what we believe in as good American conservatives.
Right.
So we've had something extraordinary happen in this country. And I've spent 20 years trying to figure out how it happened. I got stuff to say, but it's still mind-blowing to me that it happened. And I would have been one of those people. If I had been in that group, I would have said also, that would not happen in America. Or maybe it's something like that happened in Germany because, well, they had been through so many big traumas, World War I and the hyperinflation and all that terrible stuff that they went through in the Versailles Treaty, But, we Americans, we've had relatively smooth sailing. So something extraordinary has arisen, and it looks like the kind of thing that it is a human responsibility to take sides against.
Okay. I will take that under consideration. I want to remind you folks, you are listening to Andrew Schmookler, and we're talking about how the evolutionary perspective gives us a better human story. Final question that I want to ask you on this subject, and then we're going to wrap things up. Is there such a thing as a proper or appropriate evolutionary perspective? And the sub-question to that is, and where can we find out more about it?
Well, in terms of what, in the piece that we've only discussed the first half of, there are two evolutionary principles that I put forward. And we've discussed the one that what is life-serving is the creation of order. Or serving life requires the creation of order of certain kinds, I guess would probably be a better way of putting it. And out of that, I derived everything I've been saying, though we didn't spell out fully how it is that our stepping onto the path of civilization leads to things like what we're having to deal with in America now, and what we're having to deal with in the Russian invasion of Ukraine now, and what we're having to deal with climate change now. So, but the other evolutionary principle that we did not get into, I'd be happy to do another conversation about.
We absolutely will.
Which is this, that evolution crafts creatures so that pretty much across the board, but not 100%, whatever characteristics we see in the creatures are there because they helped the ancestors who had those tendencies or those characteristics or whatever to survive. In other words, there were those who had this in their inherent endowment, and those who didn't, and those who did were more likely to get their DNA into the future. And one of the essential dimensions of that, and this has everything to do with the defects in our secular worldview now, one of the central characteristics of how we are shaped is the experiential realm. I mean, we have individual differences, we have cultural differences, but we are born with certain tendencies of experience, which include finding certain things better and seeking them out, certain things worse and trying to avoid them. And such as having a certain special kind of experience that we tend to call spiritual experiences, a spiritual dimension to experience. It's part of the human genome that can be pretty well shown empirically as a fact. That special kind of characteristic is also there. And both of those I can prove are real because they're there. They are manifestations of what has been rewarded by the world we have lived in. They are important. We experience them as important, and they have huge impact. And they are life-serving because they wouldn't be there if they hadn't helped our ancestors to survive. So we need to turn to those two realms of experience from which we derive the moral dimension and the spiritual dimension as things that we should honor and pay attention to, not like our secular worldview give short shrift to as not really real because they're not objective. The experiential realm, the evolutionary perspective shows, is real and important and life-serving, and we need to honor it because we can get guidance from there about how to meet the challenges we face if life is going to defeat death in this human saga. So those two pieces come together at the end.
And we will have you back to talk about part 2, or the second piece, that second principle of yours, since we did not get a chance to dive into it the way we should, and absolutely can. So I am actually publicly inviting you back to talk about that.
If nominated, I will run, and if elected, I will serve. You're not going to get any Sherman-esque refusals. I'm not going to say I would rather be right than a host because you let me be both. So
Absolutely,
I deeply appreciate. By the way.
Well, the beautiful thing is that you are a host too of your own radio program at one time, and it shows in the experience that you have here answering the questions that I put forth to you, and I'll be honest with you, I do appreciate it, and even challenging me on my own perspective, on my own beliefs, because. As I've probably shared with you before, I had a guest on who he was talking about his thing, and I then shared my perspective. And he says, "Yeah, well, let me just tell you." And then he shared another perspective, and I thought about it and I pondered. And in the context of the interview, I said, "Well, there goes another one of my grass huts up in flames, and I'd rather burn them all down and start over than continue with something that doesn't work."
Let me distinguish between myself as a host and myself as a guest.
Okay.
I had 10 years of doing radio out here in the Shenandoah Valley. And those were 10 years when I was really into inquiry. I mean, there are a lot of basic questions I was asking, and I was driven by the quest to understand things better. there was a time starting in 1970 when I had an answer I wanted to deliver to the world. And that drove me for 20 years or something like that. And we've been talking about a lot of that right here. And then I sort of went into the process of inquiry. And I introduced my show by saying, let's talk about the questions of meaning and value we face in our lives. And let's talk in a spirit of genuine inquiry, as if we might actually learn something from each other. But then something happened to me, seeing something, and I've come back to being, wanting to be a guest, to deliver something. I'm not asking questions. I'm giving answers. I hope people don't think it's too arrogant, but it's what I feel called to do. I've seen something which has seared my soul, which has given me a sense of how it all hangs together. And I don't want to sound grandiose, but it's my conviction that could help us survive on this planet. And I love the things that I don't want to have us destroy.
Right.
So I feel like I got to do it.
Absolutely.
So that's why I come on here, delivering, coming down from my own personal Mount Sinai with what I got. And I hope it doesn't turn people off, but I just got to do it.
Well, it's here. We've placed all of this information on our giant smorgasbord table for people to partake of. If they do, wonderful. I hope they will. And I hope they'll keep coming back as you keep coming back here to tell me your story. I'm Richard Dugan, and we are talking with Andrew Schmookler, and we are going to wrap things up here in just a moment. But again, thank you so much for the time you've given us here on this program. We look forward to having you back again to continue this conversation about this subject we've been talking about, how the evolutionary perspective gives us a better human story. And it'll be part 2 that'll be coming your way here, hopefully shortly. We'll set that up and talk about the second principle of Andrew Schmookler, Dr. Schmookler's thesis, if you will, on how the evolutionary perspective gives us a better human story. Again, thank you so much. And I thank you for listening to and watching Tell Me Your Story, New Paradigms for a New World. We are giving you choices and knowledge of those choices to help make your dreams come true. And until our next broadcast, podcast, videocast, love to Lal. Jeanette, I am listening. And Dad, be happy.